The last year of Nixon's time in office was one of stagnation. Not much got done in the realm of foreign policy, even domestic policy, as Nixon struggled with what should be released to Congress, what should be released to the public, and the nation was focused on the presidency, was focused on the Watergate scandals. And for the average American, everything seemed to be spiraling out of control. The government was run amok. The government was improperly managed. The president was a crook. Inflation was out of control. The recession was deepening. The oil crisis had gotten worse. The average American is waiting in gas lines to simply get fuel. The prices at the grocery store are going up, and Americans just simply seem to feel that the world was spiraling out of their grasp. And to make matters worse, the U.S. now had an unelected, unknown, and certainly unloved president. Gerald Rudolph Ford Jr., which, by the way, if you want to win at a good game of trivia, especially if you're asking your friends trivia questions, ask them who is the president with the birth name Leslie Lynch King Jr. That was Gerald Ford's birth name, and he was adopted by his stepfather later in life, and he took the name of his stepfather, so Gerald Rudolph Ford was born Leslie Lynch King. But now, Gerald Ford, a congressman from Michigan, the minority leader in the House, was the President of the United States, unelected to the vice presidency, unelected to the presidency, and he has to bring order out of chaos. In fact, if you were to look for a theme for the Ford White House, it would be one of attempted healing. Attempt to heal the presidency, to heal the nation, both domestically and internationally. Ford was, in fact, a nice guy caught up in bad circumstances, and his efforts to calm the nation probably have not been duly noted by historians and by political scientists. That in the long term, he probably did serve as a healer. But in the short term, in the immediate term, his attempts to calm the nation seem to make more conflict and seem to make more matters worse rather than better. On August the 9th, 1974, Richard Nixon resigns and Gerald Ford becomes President of the United States. And you see in the picture, Chief Justice Warren Burger swearing in Ford as president. He keeps most of Nixon's cabinet, at least through the initial transition period. But then in a move which left the nation scratching their heads collectively, and in many instances it was a welcome decision, in other instances it was seen as weakness or worse, a corrupt bargain. And that is on September the 8th, 1974, President Ford officially issues a pardon for any real or undiscovered crimes that Richard Nixon had committed. And so he's given a get-out-of-jail-free card, you might say. And many criticize Ford for this, thinking that the wheels of justice had ground to a halt, that justice hadn't been served, that Nixon should at least have been made to answer for his crimes. Now, most of those are coming from the left, who wanted to see nothing short of drawing and quartering Nixon would have been sufficient. On the right, there were those who were glad to see Nixon pardoned, but who feared that by pardoning that it would lead to it didn't exonerate Nixon, and it certainly didn't vindicate the presidency. Either way, President Ford announced that he did it to heal the nation's wounds and to end the long national nightmare. He follows this with an even more startling pardon. So here you have him trying to heal the nation's wounds politically. And then he follows that with an official pardon for draft evaders and deserters, those who had avoided the war, gone to Canada. Now, this isn't a blanket pardon. It came with a price. Ford insisted that, and to put this in perspective, you have these draft evaders and deserters who run to Canada, and rather than giving the nation a commitment, a period of service, some even giving their life in Vietnam or in national service where they didn't go to Vietnam, they got off scot-free, and this pardon, if it had been a blanket pardon, would have said, just come back, we love you, man, all's forgiven. But Ford didn't agree with that. He, in fact, put a stipulation in the pardon that they could be pardoned if they returned and then did 2 years of community service to give back and to make amends for what they did. And some did take advantage of this, wanting to return home. Others were angered that it appeared that they had committed some crime and they didn't feel their draft evasion or their desertion was a crime, that they were taking a higher stand. But either way, the American governmental position is they had to do community service. And so Ford attempts to heal the nation, not only politically, but socially, to put the pains of the Vietnam War behind. Ford not only continues healing politically and domestically, but he tries to engage in international healing as well. In 1974 and 75, the United States and Soviet Union's diplomats engage in years-long negotiations to reduce tensions around the globe, and these were formalized with a series of agreements called the Helsinki Accords. And you see President Ford and Leonid Brezhnev signing the accords. And to punctuate the importance of these accords, President Ford even traveled to the Soviet Union, arriving in Vladivostok, where he began the negotiations that will result in later in President Carter's administration, will result in a treaty called the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty Number 2, SALT II. He begins the negotiations that end up there. So he's trying to heal, continue détente and continue healing the breach with our former ally, the Soviet Union. He not only visits the Soviet Union, he travels to China, he travels to the Middle East, he sends Henry Kissinger, his Secretary of State, to all of those locations on his behalf to work out a foreign policy that brings the world back from the brink of World War III. Unfortunately for Ford, these diplomatic successes and traveling to the Soviet Union, working out a major agreement, the Helsinki Accords, you would think would afford Ford a high place in presidential rankings, but all of his efforts are overshadowed, and no fault of him of Gerald Ford. They're overshadowed by the fall of Saigon, the fall of South Vietnam, and the ending of everything that the United States had fought for in the 60s and early 70s in Vietnam. And as we talked about while we were discussing Vietnam, Ford went to Congress and asked for permission to send troops back into South Vietnam to protect the Saigon government, to prevent the collapse, and Congress simply refused. And so, due to no fault of Gerald Ford, but he has the defeat in Vietnam, or the defeat of South Vietnam laid at his doorstep, even though he did everything he could within constitutional bounds to prevent it. The one area, not only does he not get credit for his international successes, but Gerald Ford doesn't get credit for his domestic initiatives. President Ford tried to bring in congressional spending by using his veto pen more than any president since Herbert Hoover. He vetoed 39 pieces of legislation, which came close to Herbert Hoover, but he did it in half of the time that Herbert Hoover did. So he certainly knew how to wield the veto pen, which doesn't win him friends in Congress. Congress controlled by the Democrats are certainly not going to approve legislation that makes Ford look good. Ford vetoing legislation that the Democrats pass presents the nation with what many have called gridlock. Ford made some bad policy decisions when it came to the economy. The first was he chose not to follow the Calvin Coolidge, Warren Harding Calvin Coolidge model, echoed by John F. Kennedy and Dwight Eisenhower, which was when there is a recession, one of the things that you do to ease a recession is to lower taxes. Ford chose not to lower taxes, fearing of increased deficits and government spending. So while he chose not to lower taxes because federal spending remained high, the recession deepened and bordered on the verge of a depression. Unemployment approached 10%. And deficit spending hit record highs. Americans sitting in those gas lines. I was a kid. I remember sitting in the gas lines. The cities, municipalities, states would issue directives that you could only get gas on days, odd or even days, depending on your license plate. If your license plate ended in an even number, then you could get gas on even days. If it ended in an odd number, you could get gas on odd number days. If you ran out of gas, tough luck. Get your friends to buy you some. So you took advantage on days that your license plate matched up. But even then, you would go wait in line to get that gas, and by the time you got to the pump, they may run out of gas. So Ford's answer to the stagflation that was paralyzing the nation, his answer was to issue a propaganda war, and he called his propaganda war the WIN, which stands for Whip Inflation Now. So win buttons and win signs spread across the nation, urging in almost a Hoover-esque way the nation to whip inflation. And he used a series of wage and price controls. So wage and price controls with the WIN slogan behind it, to freeze wages, to freeze prices, in hopes of getting a handle on inflation and the rise of prices. With that, a number of cities hovered on the brink of bankruptcy. New York City announced that it was about to default on its payroll, and that New York City would go bankrupt and default on its bonds, and asked the federal government for a bailout. Ford's knee-jerk reaction was no bailouts for cities. Cities that engaged in wasteful spending, they had been filled with corruption, they'd issued ill-advised bonds, and that they had caused their current position, they could get themselves out of it. Well, the New York Times began running series of articles about how President Ford had declared war on New York City, and public pressure became such that Ford changes his mind and he signs a congressional bill guaranteeing loans to cover New York City's debt. And so he's reluctantly drug into the bailout of New York City. To borrow a modern phrase, New York was too big to fail, and so he was forced to go along. But it was clear to the public he didn't like it. His propaganda war became the subject of jokes, and it appeared that Ford was a bumbling president, bumbling from one program to another, And this was made worse by Ford the Man, the new program on TV, Saturday Night Live. Chevy Chase played Gerald Ford. And Gerald Ford was known for a number of literal missteps. He stumbled down the stairs of Air Force One. He stumbled across the tarmac. He had tripped and almost fallen a number of times in very high-profile settings. And every Saturday night on Saturday Night Live, Chevy Chase would always reenact President Ford and do some bumbling routine that furthered that image in the minds of the American public that Ford was an incompetent, bumbling idiot, which is not true. But his policies, especially domestic policies, just didn't work. And stagflation continued, and it would continue on into the election and have a dramatic impact upon the election. One last insult to injury before the elections was the capture in May of 1975. May of 1975, as Saigon is falling and South Vietnam is collapsing, the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia sees an American merchant ship, the Mayaguez, in international waters. Now, international waters based upon the 3-mile limit that the United States recognized, but the Cambodian government had extended that, I believe, to 7 or 10 miles. And so the ship was, according to the Cambodian interpretation of international law, the Mayaguez was passing through their territorial waters. For the crew, based upon their interpretation of international law, they were in international waters. The Cambodian government, using captured American swift boats, so on the bottom, popularized by Secretary of State John Kerry when he ran for president. He had served on swift boats, and these, in previous war called PT boats, but gunboats, had captured the Mayaguez and removed its crew, held its crew hostage. Ford had authorized a rescue and sent in the Marines to perform the rescue, but the Marines landed on the wrong island and then got into a firefight with the Cambodians, and in the resulting firefight, vehicle malfunctions. A number of Americans were killed in the firefight, and all of it occurred while the Navy, and you see the USS Harold Holt beside the Mayaguez, Cambodia had released the Mayaguez's crew. So while we're engaged in a firefight with the Cambodian government and Marines are being killed in mechanical failures, the crew had already been released from the ship, which then furthered that impression of a bumbling president who didn't know that the prisoners had been released. Simple fact was he didn't know that the prisoners had been released. It's happening simultaneously, and they didn't have immediate communications with the released hostages. And so the Mayaguez incident, because it occurred in Cambodia near the Vietnamese border, is kind of seen as the last casualties of the Vietnam conflict. President Ford was also the target in 1975 of a number of assassination attempts. Lynette Squeaky Fromm, follower of Charles Manson, tried to assassinate Ford. In fact, got at point-blank range, drew out her pistol. You see her in her cell. They had her display her leg holster, where she had hidden the gun, but she had not chambered around. So when she pulled the trigger, the hammer fell on an empty chamber, and of course the Secret Service took her down, captured her, and put her in prison. The other attempted assassin was Sarah Jane Moore. She, on September 22nd, 1975, and you can see the view that she would have. This picture's taken from where she would have been. She fired a shot and missed, and then was captured. In fact, I think the picture was taken right after the shot was fired, and she was captured and put in prison as well. I believe she's still alive and has been released, but the question is whether she's actually repentant for trying to assassinate the president. She was definitely a revolutionary that wanted to see Ford go down. And so 2 attempts, both of them women, by the way, on Ford, and both of them failed. So going into the 1976 campaign year, you have the bumbling President Ford, and you have the Democrats searching for a candidate. And as one Democrat operative said, the Democrats in 1976 could have run an aardvark and it would have won as president. Well, it was a little closer than that, but the amazing thing is President Ford, as the sitting party member, was able to fight off a challenge from California Governor Ronald Reagan. So in the 1976 primaries, Ford's leadership was challenged by Ronald Reagan, and Ford was able to eke out a win from Ronald Reagan and go into the national election. Now, the argument can be made that the Republican Party was trying to, in fact, save Reagan for a later election. I'm not sure that I buy that. Studying Republican Party politics, they're not known for conserving politicians. They would have rather Ronald Reagan been thrown under the bus and lose the 76 election, and thus negating his conservatism, and then opening up the door for them to nominate somebody that they really wanted, like a Nelson Rockefeller or a Taft, all who were prominent in the party at the time. Or you can see in the picture of Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford shaking hands, you see Nelson Rockefeller over Ford's shoulder, but to the rear of Reagan, off to the edge of the picture on the far left, beside Mrs. Reagan, is Bob Dole, a future candidate for president. So he was waiting in the wings for his opportunity as well. In the nomination process, the Democrats turned to a dark horse candidate, the governor of Georgia, James Earl Carter, who ran as kind of the antithesis of your normal politician. He was a Washington outsider. He was not involved in a lot of national politics, but he was able to spend the year of 75, 76 campaigning and garnering enough Democratic primary votes to win out over the field proposed. He was a Southern Baptist, he was a moralist, and he chose to not hide his Southern Baptist roots, but instead promote it. He promised Americans that he would, and I quote, "I will never tell a lie to the American people." He promised to revive the moralism of Woodrow Wilson. If you remember so many videos ago where we talked about Woodrow Wilson and his moralistic diplomacy. Well, it didn't work so well for Woodrow Wilson, and by the way, it's not going to work so well for Jimmy Carter. He called on the nation for national repentance. He called on the nation for personal sacrifice and for national redemption. Those are three things the United States has never been that fond of: repentance, self-sacrifice, and redemption. All of them good Southern Baptist ideas, but not something that sells in national politics. But in the end, Carter is able to amass enough states and combination of states to seize the day. And so with the solid South and enough northern states supporting him, because out west, Gerald Ford dominates, which, Ford from Michigan is able to take his home state and half of the Midwest and then all of the West. So it was closer than it initially appeared. And so James Earl Carter becomes president, the peanut farmer from Plains, Georgia, who tried to rekindle the spirit of FDR. But as one reporter said, neither Ford nor Carter won as many votes as Mr. Nobody. Well, what does that mean? Well, it means in the election of 1976, more people stayed home who were eligible to vote than actually voted in the election. And so Mr. Nobody got more votes than either Ford or Carter. But Carter's going to stir the memory of especially the older Americans by bringing forward the spirit of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He did gimmicky things. President and Mrs. Carter on Inauguration Day, rather than riding in the limo down Pennsylvania Avenue in their inaugural parade, they walked. Now, of course, it wasn't raining or sleeting or snowing or any of the other weather cataclysms that hit D.C., but they walked the nice sunny day. They walked the inaugural parade, which was, to the American people, it seemed to be a refreshing thing. Someone who, in the White House, refused presidential privilege. Carter was known, as he got on and off Air Force One, to carry his own luggage, to carry his own bags. He didn't like White House staff and servants waiting on him. He liked to wear in rekindling the fireside chats of the FDR administration. He would appear on the fireside chat set with cardigan sweaters. In fact, Newsweek would call his fireside chats, instead of a fireside chat, they would call it cornbread with a cardigan atmosphere. Another journalist noted that during one televised fireside chat, as Carter was talking to the nation, the crackling fire beside him went out. And so there were a lot of things that he did that were gimmicky and yet tended to backfire. In fact, speaking of Saturday Night Live, one of my favorite Saturday Night Live skits from the 70s, which was all the more sweet because I was a young kid and my parents didn't like me watching Saturday Night Live, so it was like forbidden fruit. But one of the skits they did with Jimmy Carter, they had Jimmy Carter had a degree in nuclear physics and had been in the Navy, serving on nuclear submarines. And he was known to have a lot of book smarts and to be very technical. And so in this skit, he's sitting around the fireside in his cardigan sweater, and he's taking calls from the average American, and one's from a postal employee that's having a problem with his mail sorting machine. And Carter knows just the right fix to tell him how to fix this mail sorting machine. And that's really what Carter brings to the presidency, is a micromanaging of the government. He starts off well, at least from one perspective he starts off well. He announces a general amnesty for draft dodgers and deserters that didn't require community service. So going one step beyond Ford, he authorizes the general amnesty for those who fled to Canada during the war, that they could return home without doing community service. What really angered the public, and I remember my dad going ballistic with this, was a series of diplomatic negotiations that Carter engaged in, and one of those was to turn control of the Panama Canal back over to Panama. You see, when the United States liberated Panama from Colombia, And I want to put that out there in case you don't remember it from lecture so long ago. But the United States had liberated Panama from Colombia and then entered into a perpetual lease, paying them for the canal zone and paying them annual rent. The United States still paid them annual rent, and Carter could have renegotiated the Panama Canal Treaty to continue American control. But remember, he's a moralist when it comes to especially foreign policy, and so he decides to return the Panama Canal to the Panamanians. And so in the treaty, Torrijos-Carter Treaty of 1977, President Carter negotiates the return by 1999, the transfer of control, and you see President Carter, former President Carter, in attendance as the ceremony transfers the last of the control of the Panama Canal back over to the Panamanian government. Which is all well and good, except the United States now has lost its most strategic position in the Western Hemisphere. The Panama Canal allowed the transport of a two-ocean navy back and forth. It sped up trade and was seen as absolutely vital to the strategic placement of American assets. But Carter saw it as needed to diffuse anti-colonialism and to appease and kind of undo America's bad neighbor policies that had gone on in the past. Unfortunately for him, it didn't really change Latin America's view of the United States. In fact, as the Canal Treaty was being negotiated, Republican future candidate and past candidate Ronald Reagan claimed that the canal zone was sovereign American soil purchased fair and square during Theodore Roosevelt's administration. Now, a Democratic senator, using a lot of sarcasm here, stated, and I quote, "We stole it fair and square, so why can't we keep it?" End the quote. Well, we didn't steal it to start with. But nonetheless, the canal zone reverts back to Panama at the turn of the millennium, or almost at the turn of the millennium. President Carter would go on to normalize relations with China in what many considered a misstep, whereas Nixon had visited China. Nixon had recognized China, but it had not been a formal recognition, because to recognize Communist China as the legitimate government of China, he had to break diplomatic relations with Taiwan, our ally. Carter severs diplomatic relations with Taiwan and recognizes formally China and the communists in China as the legitimate government. Many saw this as a sellout of Taiwan and furthered the perception that the United States was a dwindling superpower. Now, to give Carter his due, he had some diplomatic success with the Camp David Accords. The Camp David Accords were probably the greatest success of his presidency, because it brought Egypt and Israel together in a negotiated peace. In 1977, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, that you see on the far left, on Carter's right, Egyptian President Anwar Sadat, flew to Tel Aviv at the invitation of Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. And the two officially would meet in Israel. And following the meeting, Anwar Sadat announced to the world that he was willing to negotiate the legitimacy, recognize the legitimacy, and enter into negotiations with the State of Israel, something no Middle Eastern country had done, officially recognize Israel as a nation. So President Carter invited both men to Washington, D.C., and they retreated to Camp David, where they spent weeks negotiating. And in the agreement that emerges, the Egypt-Israeli Peace Treaty of 1979, in the first part, Israel surrenders the Sinai Peninsula, gives back to Egypt the Sinai Peninsula, and in turn, Egypt officially recognizes Israel as a state. And by the way, this was completed in 1982. The second part of the agreement, though, was more problematic. Sadat urged Israel to give up the areas around the Jordan River that they had captured, the West Bank, to surrender that to the Palestinians and to allow the creation of a Palestinian state. This was problematic in that Israel didn't want to give up the land, and the Palestinians didn't want just the West Bank. They wanted all of the land that Israel occupied. And so this part of the agreement never was manifest, but it was the closest that any peace agreement had come in the Middle East in a score of years. And so the Camp David Accords seemed to be a huge step forward. The official signing ceremony took place on March 26, 1979, and immediately most of the Arab nations condemned Anwar Sadat as a traitor to their cause, recognizing Israel. For poor Carter, the economy continued to worsen. The stagflation of the Nixon and Ford years became worse. The recession by the end of Carter's 4 years in office, unemployment had reached almost 8%, about 7.5%. Interest rates had reached 20%, and inflation was at a whopping 13%. The economy was flat and moving backwards. Stagnation with inflation. And that's why I entitled the presentation Malaise, the Ford and Carter years, and Malaise, the Nixon years, because that's what it reflects. The American nation just seemed to be struggling on every front. Carter continued to enjoy success building on what Ford had done with the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty. The Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty 2, SALT II, would have limited the number of bombers and missiles that both sides could have to some 2,350 bombers and missiles. But it also set limits on the number of warheads, which is something SALT I didn't do, set the number on the number of warheads and the creation of new missile systems. To appease those who questioned the value of SALT II and saw it as a sellout, Carter introduced a new missile program, and it's not really a new missile program, it's a variation on a theme, called the MX program. The MX missile system was to use underground railroads and staging areas around the United States, and these underground railroads would ship nuclear weapons, nuclear missiles, from one silo to another. And so the Soviets would never be sure as to what silo site had the real missiles. It was like the game you put on the table with the shells and the marbles. You know, which shell actually has the marble? Well, that's what Carter's doing, is he's playing silo shuffle, and these underground railroads would haul these missiles around, and it would give the United States at least a semblance, because the Soviet Union is going to have to use 3 warheads to get any one missile in its silo. Chances are real good, as one critic called this, I cannot pass up this quote. They said that SALT II and the MX missile program was like a combination of a ride at Disney World with Armageddon. And so the treaty came under fire from both the left and the right. Many questioned whether the treaty could even pass the Senate, but it became an irrelevant issue when in 1979 the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. This openly aggressive expansion of the Soviet Union into Afghanistan forced Carter to withdraw the SALT II treaty from negotiations, and it was shelved. It was withdrawn from the treaty, withdrawn from the Senate, and thus never became a formal treaty. Carter not only withdrew SALT II, he declared that since the 1980 Olympics was going to be held in Moscow, that the United States would boycott the 1980 Olympics in protest of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Carter said that the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan stood as one of the greatest threats to the future of the world since World War II. But soon this is going to be proven to be just merely saber-rattling, and that Carter, and this was used at the time in Newsweek and Time magazine, they started referring to the United States as a paper tiger. And the event that would prove that out was the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979. In 1979, Iran underwent a revolution with Muslim revolutionaries led by the man on Time magazine, the Ayatollah Khomeini. Leading those revolutionaries overthrow the government of the Shah of Iran that the United States had put in place in 1953. Khomeini had been a supporter of Mohammad Mossadegh in 53, so he's got a long-standing grudge against the United States. He is Muslim and didn't like the developing Camp David Accords. He didn't like the growth of the relationship between Israel, Egypt, and the United States. He protested American support for Israel in all of the conflicts that had occurred since the creation of Israel. He opposed the CIA-trained SAVAK, S-A-V-A-K, which are initials that stand for the Shah's secret police. And he became extremely angry after the Shah was overthrown and went into exile. The United States allowed the Shah of Iran to enter the United States for cancer treatment. And so the Ayatollah Khomeini and his followers stormed the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, which, by the way, is considered and should have been considered by Jimmy Carter as an act of war. Whenever an embassy is attacked, that is sovereign soil. And in fact, only twice before the fall of Saigon well, this is the third time, the fall of Saigon and the storming of the American embassy. Tehran and the storming of the embassy here, and the only other time was in the Tripoli and the cutting down of the American flagpole at the embassy during the Barbary pirate wars of the early 1800s. In storming the embassy, the American embassy personnel were captured, and in a comedy of errors, the embassies are installed with a massive furnace that all sensitive, top-secret documents can be dumped in the furnace. It's got a jet flame that burns everything to a crisp. Well, the furnace was broken, so the embassy personnel are dropping papers into the shredders, and of course the Iranians then take all of those shredded documents and reassemble them, and no American secrets that the embassy held. But 53 American hostages, both Marine guards for the embassy and embassy personnel and diplomats, were held hostage. Daily on the news, and the Iranians were very aware of the U.S. news cycle. They would stage demonstrations at times right before the news cycle would hit, so that they would have protesters burning the American flag, hanging Carter in effigy, burning Carter's effigy, otherwise desecrating the American flag, and chanting "Death to America." Carter appealed to the United Nations to intervene for the 53 American hostages, but when the United Nations called upon the Ayatollah Khomeini to release those hostages, Khomeini scoffed at them. The U.S. in retaliation froze Iran's assets in the United States. Billions of dollars of assets were frozen, and called upon Europe to do the same, but Europe was dependent upon Iran's oil and refused. And so throughout 1979 and into 1980 and into 81, American hostages would be held in Iran, systematically beaten and tortured and insulted and made to confess crimes that they didn't commit. In 1980, Carter authorized a rescue mission, sending in helicopters to rescue, only to have the rescue aborted because of helicopter malfunctions. And 8 U.S. service personnel were killed in the rescue attempt when a plane and a transport plane and a helicopter collided in the desert. And probably the final straw in the Carter presidency came with the 4 days into the Iranian hostage crisis. Ted Koppel, a young reporter, begins a new nightly news program. It came on immediately after the news, the 10 o'clock news here locally. 10:30 Nightline began with Ted Koppel hosting, and he would take something from the news cycle. And every night, as Nightline began, he would open up with a yellow screen, and on it he would say, day number, and put whatever day it is, day number 254 of the Iranian hostage crisis. And it was almost like each day as that number went up, Carter's popularity declined. And so the growth of Nightline. The yellow ribbon campaign, you see it today, people wearing ribbons on their collars or on their lapels to advocate different causes. That began in 1979, 1980, based upon a Tony Orlando and Dawn song called "Tie a Yellow Ribbon Around the Old Oak Tree." And it became the symbol for the American hostages. And so yellow ribbons tied on street signs, tied on trees. People wore strips of yellow ribbon. That became a way for impotent Americans to show support for the hostages in Iran. And so Jimmy Carter, as the election approaches, has the American hostage crisis looming over him, and he seems to be impotent and a paper tiger. And so he enters into the 1980 campaign, a president besieged by the economy, stymied by international affairs, and unable to accomplish anything of lasting effect. And we'll pick up with the election of 1980 in the next video.